This incident occurred in the late 1990s. I was a young American woman living near a larger city, and one weekend I decided to experience some nightlife with some friends. We were driving next to a sidewalk. It was probably 10 p.m. when a tall, skinny guy waved us down and asked for a ride. We hesitated. There was barely any room left in our little red Subaru anyway, but he was well dressed and decent looking, so we figured that he had a reasonable explanation. We asked him where his car was, and he said that he never owned one, but that he once totaled his parents on purpose. We thought that was a little weird, so we jokingly asked him what he had against his parents. He then proceeded to launch into a tirade against the auto industry, about how cars are dangerous, polluting gas guzzlers, and how no one would be driving them in 50 years. He finished by saying that he'd been contemplating slashing our tires. He patted his coat pocket, implying that he carried a knife, once we let him out, but we were such nice girls that he couldn't bring himself to do it. By this point, we were all pretty scared, obviously, so we politely asked him if his destination was close enough for him to be able to walk the rest of the way, especially given his burning hatred for car travel. He shrugged his shoulders and mumbled something, and then he abruptly exited the car before we had even come to a complete stop, mind you. We drove as fast as we could, but we all just went home after that, and luckily, none of us ever encountered that dude again. So, this is a quick incident that happened just a few moments ago, and it has me freaked out, and I just want to share it. It's a quiet afternoon, and I'm slowly cleaning the kitchen. It's surprisingly quiet outside, as typical, when it's nice out, that is. The neighborhood kids are running around and being rambunctious as they usually do. I'm enjoying the quiet and finishing uploading the dishwasher, and decided to go outside for a smoke. I'm putting my flip-flops on and head for the front door. I open the door, and then I hear a very, very distinct "Ma." Now, when my daughter is looking for me around the house, she'll say the same thing, with a distinct tone of voice and inflection that I'd recognize anywhere. It came from the back door that leads into the yard, and it spooked me because I know that she's away at her father's house until after dinner today. She called me about 10 seconds after I heard it, though, and it proper spooked me, and I really don't know what to think about any of this. Today I share this as a 36-year-old man. You'll have to bear with me too, as the details of this story are a bit vague and also a bit of a blur, but I'll share what I remember. In the summer of 1993, I was in the first grade. My parents had been divorced for many years, with my mother having sole custody. As a child, I barely remembered my father, but he would make his brief appearances or send gifts on Christmas or my birthdays. But seeing my dad always made me happy, as I was far too young to comprehend the complexities of a battered relationship or marriage. And after school one day, I was shocked to come outside to see my father waiting for me. My grandma usually picked me up from school, but never my dad. He had a small black car, a beater. He always seemed to dress nice, suspenders and slacks, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. I remember getting into his car and smelling what I now know as an adult to be clove. I later gathered that he had a habit of rolling his own cigarettes, and gained that he must have been in a clove phase. There's a bit of gap in time here that I really can't remember, but it's now nighttime, and I'm watching the fluorescent lights from miscellaneous stores fly by my passenger seat window. A gas station I can't really remember, Braum's ice cream at an intersection, and more time loss. I'm now running around with another kid, in and out yellow-lit apartment corridors. Some doors are open and we go into one. There are kids in a back bedroom playing Sega. I watch as Sonic zips through loops and listen to familiar music that momentarily makes me feel safe. But then I suddenly realize that I'm very alone with complete strangers and find my way back outside. There's another gap. My belly is full from beans and burritos, and I'm looking down a very dark hallway in my father's apartment. I'm standing next to an aquarium giving blue ambient light that sits on my face. I want to go home. Something just doesn't feel right all of a sudden. In an attempt to comfort me, my father gives me a toy flashlight that projects the Batman symbol. I shine it down the black hallway. The cheap plastic of the switch fidgets and stubbornly slides, clicking on and off. My father is on the phone and he's upset, voice raised. I apologize for not knowing what happened next, but I can confidently say that I was safely returned by my father. My mother had no idea where he lived, and he would sometimes drive around at night in efforts to find the mentioned landmarks to trigger my memory. I haven't thought much about this until tonight, and it really made me feel wrong and uncomfortable, everything that happened that night. In hindsight, I was definitely being kidnapped. I really don't know the full extent of what was going on, but something just told me that something was wrong. As you may have guessed too, I don't really have a relationship with my father anymore, and who knows, maybe that's for the best. This happened to me when I was 9 years old, 28 years ago now, but I still remember it so vividly. I lived at the time in a seaside resort called Blackpool, England, in a modest 4-bedroom house. The area itself was good, with very little crime or concern, until that night. You see, I shared a bedroom with my brother. We had bunk beds, and I was on the top bunk. The bedroom was on the first floor at the rear of the property. My bedroom overlooked the back garden, and one night I was awoken by the sound of a window lock being tried. I opened my eyes and looked towards the bottom of the bed, which faced the 4 large windows. And to my horror, someone was outside, perched on the window ledge, attempting to get in through my window. I froze in horror, not daring to allow them to see that I was awake. I remember sliding back down onto my bed, keeping as still as possible. I lied there for no more than a minute, but man, it felt like a long time. My heart was beating so loudly that I was sure that it was about to give me away. With my eyes closed, I stayed still, listening to them shuffle across the next window. Unlike before, though, I could now hear a screwdriver or something in his hand, which was being used a little more forcefully to get in. But without moving, I opened one eye ever so slightly to see whether I could make out who this person was. A security light on the back of the property suddenly triggered mid-look. I panicked. Surely now he had seen me. Now he must have known that I was there. Staring back at me was a dark figure, black clothes, wearing a matching balaclava, only his eyes on show, and this horrible, startled, piercing look, clearly having been caught off guard by the security light. He froze, and just stared. He didn't move an inch. I was now sat up, equally as stunned, staring back, locked by fear. I immediately jumped off the top of my bunk. There wasn't time for stares, screaming for my parents as I ran out of the room and into theirs. They tried convincing me that it was a bad dream and told me to get back into bed, but there was absolutely no chance of that happening, and after a couple of minutes they agreed to go and investigate, which simply entailed looking through the bedroom window. Nobody was there. They had gone. I got back into bed, still almost frozen with fear. What if he had gotten in? He might be in the bedroom right now. He could comfortably fit into my wardrobe or even under my bed. My brother, who was 6 years my junior, had slept through the whole episode and was no use. Looking down my bed towards the windows again, I noticed that the latch on the 4th window, it had been left open inside, which means that a simple pull from the outside would have easily opened it. I shut my eyes and remember silent tears falling down my cheeks. If he was in my room and knew that I was awake, he might harm me to keep me quiet. Pretending to be asleep seemed the best option, and eventually I must have nodded off. I was woken up the next day by the sound of my cat outside screeching in the garden. Daylight came through the windows, and the bedroom didn't feel anywhere near as scary as the night before. Cautiously, I walked towards my bedroom window. I noticed marks from the window's locks from the outside where the paint had been scraped, which means that it wasn't just a bad dream. My cat screeched again, and I heard a commotion outside below me in the garden. 3 police sniffer dogs were parading around. A policeman was stood talking to my mum. I rushed outside, but was quickly ushered back into the house and was told to take the cat indoors. The look on my mum's face, I knew that she was trying to hide something from me. The ambulance, which arrived a short while later, gave it all away, though. Apparently, it had turned out that someone had broken into the house next door through the back bedroom windows. The motive? Well, it appeared to have been a simple theft, but the elderly lady who came across the intruder had been found dead at the bottom of her stairs. And the police, they never found out who it was. But then again, they never dusted our windows for prints, as my story was never told. We left the house and moved away within 6 months. I still think that they feel guilty for not listening to me and not acting differently. Even to this day, my parents don't wish to talk about it whenever I try and bring it up. In respect for my best friend, whose life was, to say the least, a complete mess as a child, I've been keeping this story inside for a very long time. I'm going to be completely honest. I've never even spoken a word to my mother before. At first, it was fear of getting social services involved. Then, after they got involved anyways, I guess too long had passed, and I just figured that she never really would benefit any from knowing. This all happened when we were 11 years old. I'm 29 now. It all sort of feels like a surreal dream, to be honest. This feels like the appropriate place to get it out, though. Names have been changed, of course. So, when I was in elementary school in Canada, that's K to 6, I was an awkward child. I have high-functioning autism, and while my grades were great, my social functioning was lackluster. Still is, if I'm honest. This left me with a fairly small, very colourful group of friends. Two of the closest being Jessie and Katie. Now, I came from a fairly overprotective household. My mother watched me like a hawk, and thus I was a naive kid. I didn't really understand that a lot of the oddness and dysfunction that would come out of my two friends had to do with problems at home. We were never allowed at Katie's house. I think her mum was extremely overweight to the point of hardly being able to move anyway, and she was embarrassed of it. Jessie's house, however, was only a few blocks away from the school, and we ended up there a lot. Her parents were divorced, and her mum was deaf and mute. My mum and her would communicate through notes, and when I would go over, I would hand them to her, and while she at first would always seem slightly erratic, there were no real red flags. When we first started going there, Jessie's mum was living with her boyfriend, as well as her boyfriend's parents. Everyone in the household was deaf with the exception of Jessie and her younger brother, but both of them had limited hearing. I think for the first year or so that they were there, the boyfriend's parents kind of kept everything from getting too out of hand, but it was pretty clear that it was a dysfunctional household. After they moved out of the household, it was just Jessie's mum and her boyfriend. They would often lock us in the basement too when I would spend the night there. It was a full apartment, so we just saw it as fun freedom. But the one time they forgot to lock it and we walked in on them, shoving needles under the table. Again, we were too young to understand what was going on, but we did understand that we walked in on something bad. From this point on, we would be designated to spend our sleepover nights in her garage, as it was furnished with carpets and couches. The issue with this was, though, that Jessie's mum always kept the door locked so we wouldn't interfere with their activities again. So when one of us had to use the washroom, we would have to knock on the basement window until Jessie's little brother would hear and let us in through the basement window to pee. Another issue being, he was hearing impaired. Thus, sometimes it would take a literal hour of absolute banging on that window to get anybody's attention. We were young, and this felt as close to freedom as you could get, I guess. But we didn't really understand why or what was wrong or dangerous for Jessie's mother to do this, so I guess I just never really thought about telling my mum, and it kept going on. One night, though, we were doing our normal sleepover, playing Pokemon Gold, trading and battling with link cables, and waiting for Jessie's mum to bring out the oven pizza she said that she was cooking us literal hours ago. It was about midnight, no bedtime in that household, and Katie said that she really had to pee. She was trying to wait for Jessie's mum to bring in the pizza so she could go through the door, but she couldn't hold it. She goes out by herself to try and rouse Jessie's little brother, Aaron. We were expecting it to take her a little while, but to our surprise, she comes back extremely quick, locking the garage door behind her and latching the lift door. She looks really startled too. She tells us that she was knocking to try and get Erin's attention when she hears a rustle from the bush next to the gate going to the front yard. It takes her a minute to realize what she's looking at, but standing about 5 feet from the gate, 15 feet from the window Katie is at, is a tall man dressed completely in black. She said that it seemed like he just sort of appeared out of darkness, or like he was waiting for something. He asks her if she's managed to lock herself out, while slowly taking a step towards the gate. As she gets up and takes a step back, his pace quickens towards her and she sprints back to the garage. At first, we thought that she was just messing with us. We laughed and told her to stop messing around, but then we heard it. Hard twisting of the locked doorknob. Then, worse, the sound of scratching metal against the knob. He was trying to pick the lock. We stood in absolute fear for a moment, then grabbed the only pathetic things around that we could use to try and defend ourselves. Then, it just abruptly stopped. There were no windows in her garage and no peephole on the door, so we couldn't see anything, and so we really had no idea what was going on. We waited for about 10 minutes, having no idea where the man was, if he was still out there, where her mum was, or where that pizza had got to. But we were still sitting ducks in there, and he had clearly failed to pick the lock, but who knows if or what he would try next. Now, this is stupid, I know, but we were stupid scared children. We grabbed our weapons, which consisted of glorified sticks, and we left that garage. At first, there was no sign of any man. We moved towards the downstairs window and started slamming on it, screaming and pleading for Erin to open it. Again, that's when we heard it. It was almost a sort of sing-song, mocking voice that rang out. Well, hello again. 3 men this time, all in black. The one in the middle had spoken. They made a move forward. We once again sprinted back to the garage. This time, they just straight up tried to kick the door down, all 3 of them stomping and kicking. It was close to giving in, and then everything just stopped. Jesse's mother had come out of the back door, pizza in hand, and startled them. She ran back inside, got her boyfriend and his 2 other friends, users travel in packs, and they were able to chase them off with some actual weapons. Obviously, I'm guessing about that because we were still inside the garage, but we could hear stuff. The adults stayed in the backyard all night, weapons in hand. One person even sat on the roof with a compound bow. Yeah, a compound bow. Anyway, night turned to morning and it all settled down. But after that, we never stayed at Jessie's house for sleepovers ever again. She was put into the care of her grandparents shortly after this too. It took me a really long time to actually grasp what happened that night, but considering they never actually called the police, I'm fairly certain that we almost got literally murdered over some drug debt that Jessie's mother probably had. Literally, I can't even imagine the evils that could have gone on that night if fate wasn't on my side. Something tells me that those 3 men were way too happy to find children to take as penance, and it would hardly have just been a straightforward murder. It still makes me shudder thinking about it, and I'm just really glad that we all ended up okay that night. In Mexican folklore, an archetypical witch is the lechuza or owl witch. It is said a lechuza makes a pact with Satan or other evil spirits in order to gain this ability. They're often portrayed as older women, and it is said that he removed her legs and hide them while they're out in owl form. As a child, I was told legends by my maternal grandmother who swore encounters with witches. Luckily, I didn't have any encounters, at least not until my adulthood 2 years ago. I was in Mexico in my dad's hometown, a small town of maybe 9,000. Our house in Mexico is pretty far away from the main town at the very end of a long dirt road. To the left of the road is small traditional houses, and to the right is a deep gully or trench, which was once a river, I think, and on the other side of the gully is the woods. It was around the time of the town's festival, which was an excuse for the adults to get drunk, and in the town's plaza, while the kids played at the fair. I opted on leaving early as I was tired and didn't like drinking anyway, so I hitched a ride with someone from town who lived at the beginning of the dirt road, which meant that I'd have to walk about a mile, or close enough to that. So 10 minutes into my walk, I heard what sounded like birds and assumed the birds nearby in the trees were settling down for the night. I looked at the trees, and about 10 feet up I saw a pair of eyes, bright orange, staring me down. I was unnerved, but pushed on and ignored it. I heard more rustling and looked back, noticing the eyes had gone, which led me to believe that the bird had flown away, when suddenly I heard a voice from the bottom of the gully. "Hey sir, come here." I decided to ignore it, but it kept on pestering me until finally I snapped and walked towards the gully to tell this woman to leave me alone. I started telling her that I was in a rush to get home when I noticed something weird. She was dressed in native attire, which meant that she had a long skirt, but it wasn't all the way down, and this woman's ankles were completely missing. She appeared to be floating. She looked at me with utter hatred in her eyes. I realized that she knew her secret was out at that point when I saw that, and I bolted for the house, hearing a large flapping sound following me. I looked back, and flying behind me was what I can only describe as a huge owl with bright orange eyes. I ran into the house, but I only had a few seconds of peace before something was banging on the door, screeching inhumanely. I panicked, and remembered my grandmother telling me the prayer was the best defense against a witch, which, when I started doing this, it seemingly worked as the screaming stopped. I decided to place salt in the doorways when something broke the kitchen window above the sink, and attempting to come through that window was that same owl, but this time it was sort of gargling, almost, vaguely human words, maybe? In a panic, I took the salt I was using on the doorways and just threw it at it. Immediately, it backed away from the window and perched itself on the fence, staring daggers into the window. I sat on the couch on edge all night, and eventually I must have passed out. The next morning I woke up hoping that it was all just a horrible dream, but upon entering the kitchen I saw the glass from the broken window, and when I stepped outside I saw large scratches on the front door. I walked over to the fence where this owl was perched, and on the fence and the floor surrounding it was what looked like blood. Unnerved, I started sweeping the glass out the front door when I saw her, an older native woman across the gully among the trees, staring at me. Her face was covered in what looked like small cuts with little bits of blood, as if she had been assaulted by tiny shards of glass. I knew that this was her, and I stared her back down until eventually she just sort of retreated into the trees, and after that I never saw her again. Every time I go back, I still place salt in the doorways and pray as soon as I enter that house. Often in that house I feel watched too, and other people who stay there report voices outside and stuff on the roof, and in any case, like I said, I haven't seen anything again after this, and hopefully I never will. When I was a kid, around 7 years old I think, I spent the day at a cousin's house in my old hometown. He lived right in the middle of town, so we could ride our bikes pretty much everywhere. This was back in '98, and the tiny place that I came from, everyone knows everyone and keeps an eye out for the safety of any kid they see. When my mum dropped me off at my aunt's house that morning, she gave me some money to be able to go to the corner store for some snacks for my cousin and I. After a while, hunger struck, and I took off on my bike to Reeves' Grocery. It was the best stocked store in town, and there were only 2 stores. But pulling up, I noticed an old maroon sort of coloured car parked outside. Reeves' storefront had a short brick wall about a quarter of the way up, but from the brick up to the roof was all glass. The type of glass that you can see through one side, but is a mirror on the other. I didn't pay the car too much mind at first. I rode up onto the sidewalk and gently rested the handlebars of my bike against the wall. I hopped off my bike and, by force of habit, I looked into the store window. In the reflection behind me in that old maroon car sat a little old lady in the passenger seat. She was dressed in all green, dark green, wearing a beret hat, and she had one of those sort of crocheted Afghan blankets draped around her shoulders. She looked very, very old. Deep wrinkles covered her face to the point that I couldn't even see her eyes, really, and her skin had a grey tint to it. She smiled sort of sweetly at me in the mirror, but when I turned around to wave and smile back, she wasn't in the car. Confused, I glanced back at the store window and I could still see her sitting in the passenger seat, smiling at me. Fight or flight kicked in and I aborted all thoughts of 3D Doritos and Gatorade and raced off as quickly as I could. I didn't even get on my bike in the end. I just grabbed it by the handlebars and pushed it as I ran as fast as my little legs would go. Looking back on this whole thing, the little old lady really seemed to me no harm. Her wrinkled face looked kind and her smile was warm, but my 7-year-old brain just yelled ghost and told me to run. When I told my mum about it a few days later, she told me that sometimes spirits get stuck or have unfinished business, so they can't pass on. I remember this encounter fondly these days, though, and wish that I could have better, reacted to the situation. I mean, maybe I could have helped the green lady somehow. So, I know that this is a bit of a strange one, but it's just never sat with me right, and I feel like sharing it. So my girlfriend and I are watching a show on the TV, when there's suddenly a knock on the front door at around 10 p.m. We both looked at each other like, who do you have coming over? The look between us settles, where we both shake our heads and non-verbally say, I have no idea who that is. I pause the show and get up and ask, hello, who is it? A man from the other side of the door says, do you believe in Black Lives Matter? I heard him, but the logic in my brain just didn't. Who was this man? Why was I being asked this question at 10 p.m.? What was going on? I got really confused and asked, sorry, what are you asking? The man, in an even softer, quieter voice, says, do you believe in Black Lives Matter? At this point, I was right next to the door and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. My girlfriend was behind me. I then immediately motioned her to get away from the door. I remained quiet, turned the lights off, deadbolted the door in front of the guy. What was even creepier, though, was the dude didn't say anything after that. There was no knock, there was no further interaction, just silence in the dark. I don't know when he left. In fact, he could have been there for hours for all I knew. Also, I wondered if the fact that we had an LGBT flag in one of our front windows prompted this. To make matters more strange is that I'm literally the last person to do something like that. I have a historical track record with getting myself into situations and problems with strangers for being too nice, if anything. So for me to get that feeling was really a first, and I was all freaked out, and my girlfriend was even more freaked out at how freaked out I was due to me never being like that. Anyway, in the end, it was probably one of the strangest interactions I've ever had, and like I said, something about it just has never sat with me right. I've only ever really told this to other people. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was to live in a really small apartment downtown. My place was on the bottom floor, halfway underground, on the rear corner of the building and adjacent to the driveway that led to the building's parking lot and dumpster in the back. I got home late one night between 12 and 1. My dogs had been alone for hours, so I took them on a short walk. It was a weeknight, so everything was dead quiet and nobody was outside. As we were returning home, one of my dogs started acting weird though. Not scared or particularly excited, but just sort of completely fixated, like she'd picked up a scent or something and wanted to check it out. She even started pulling the leash, which she never did. As we got closer to the building, she frantically pulled me and my other dog towards the driveway. We always went up the driveway after walks to dispose of their waste bags and enter the rear of the building where my apartment was. So I Thought that maybe she just wanted to get home for water or something. As soon as we got towards the driveway, though, she got in front of me to protect me and just sort of completely froze and stared. She was only about 40 pounds, but she was half a guard dog, and something made her alert and serious, and I took her cue, looked down the driveway, and saw something even blacker than the surrounding darkness. At first, I thought that I saw a small black dog or a raccoon, as some of my other neighbors had small dogs, and we would occasionally get raccoons in our dumpster. After a few seconds, though, I realized that it wasn't either of those things. The thing made eye contact with me, though, and started to walk towards us, and as soon as I got next to the building, I realized just how big it was, as literally stood right next to my apartment in my window. This thing was easily 4 feet off the ground on all fours, and it kind of looked like something between a wolf and maybe a bear. It was completely black, but it looked like the black was distorted or out of place, almost like how a black hole is portrayed when it's absorbing light around it. It had a few grey squiggles in the black that moved erratically, and its eyes glowed grey with a small hint of red. It looked almost somewhat animated, completely out of place in reality. When it got to the corner of the building, it stopped and stared at me, and my dog completely lost it. I'd seen that dog bark to protect me, bark at other dogs and cats, and bark at wild animals, but this was the only time that I'd ever seen her bark like this. She was howling and barking and almost yodeling simultaneously, and was completely freaked out. My second dog was completely quiet and looked almost confused at first, but just sort of stared down the driveway. After a few seconds, it was like he finally noticed what my other dog did, and he started doing the same thing, except he sounded a lot more afraid. This next part still freaks me out too when I think about it, but I was frozen in shock. The thing sort of opened its mouth and showed some teeth with more distortion and grey squiggles coming in and out of its mouth. Its eyes glowed more than before, grey and red, almost like smoke. It let out a penetrating sound like a guttural howl or growl or something, and my entire body felt like it went through me. And the strangest sensation came over me. I felt like I was connected to it somehow, is the only way that I can describe it. And that really scared me. It stared like it was looking through me for a little while longer. I'm not sure how long. And then it walked away from the driveway towards the back of the building and just disappeared. I stood there dumbfounded for a couple of minutes, wondering what the heck just happened, and contemplating whether or not to go inside or if I was going crazy. The building was locked on both sides, but all of this took place literally right next to the window to my bedroom. And after a few more minutes, it really started to just feel like it didn't actually even happen. Still, there was no way I was walking down that driveway, so I went through the front door of the building, threw the dog's waste bags out in the laundry room, went into my apartment, locked the door, checked my gun next to my bed, and invited both my dogs to sleep on the bed with me that night. I couldn't sleep for hours, but my dog that tried to protect me passed out almost immediately. Her little heart was beating through her chest, and that was the only time that I've ever seen her that afraid. I've lived there 9 years, and nothing like that has ever happened before or since then. And for those of you who are wondering, I was completely sober and no more sleep deprived than usual. I knew all of my neighbors in the building, and only 2 others had dogs, which were considerably smaller than mine, beagles and terriers. The closest thing that I've ever read to this is shadow people and those elves with squiggles. It was definitely more like an animal though, and I'll never forget its eyes. My dog's reactions tell me that I wasn't completely imagining this too. I'm a recent convert, or revert I guess, to Islam. Islam actually talks about things that exist which we cannot see, like jinn, and after my conversion a few months back, I started thinking a lot about what happened, and I don't know, I just decided to share this. I am curious about your thoughts though. What do you guys think that this could be? This happened this morning around 6:50 a.m. I was getting prepared for school and I get my clothes ready. My dad comes in telling me that he's going to drop off my mum at her job and he'll come back to pick me up. I say okay, and I shut my door and lock it since I need to change into my school clothes. I hear my mum and my dad walk out of the house and close the front entrance door, and about 10 minutes go by and I'm fixing my hair in my room. The door is still locked, when I suddenly hear the door handle in my room shake and turn rapidly, as if someone is trying to get in. In fact, the whole door started to shake as well. I immediately run to open the door thinking that it was my dad, and when I do, I find no one there. My dog then starts to bark in my direction, and she rarely barks. I stand there for about 2 minutes trying to process what the heck just happened, and then I hear my dad unlock the front entrance door and he walks in. Before I could say anything, he asks, "Are you ready yet?" I chose not to tell him what happened since he was mad that I wasn't ready to go. My mum also occasionally hears her name being called while she's asleep, but no one would be in her room. I've gotten a bit used to the paranormal events that happened at our house, but this one was more extreme than ever before. Do you guys think that I should be worried? Me and my girlfriend live in a calm and small city, so we're used to walking alone, even late at night, from her house to mine or vice versa. A few years ago, when we were 18 or 19 years old, we were going to her house alone, walking. There was nobody on the streets, and it was starting to get dark at this point. We were chatting about something and making jokes when we decided to walk by a different route, just to change the usual path up a bit. We were walking for 15 minutes, more or less, when we started to feel a little lost and thought, hey, this isn't the way home. And at this same instant, too, we heard a loud whistle as someone was whistling to get our attention. We turned back and we saw this, clown. He was there, standing still, looking at us and smiling, but something was really off. His clothes were kind of ragged. He had 3 balloons floating tied to his hand, and in the other hand, he had a huge butcher's knife. We thought that it was some kind of a joke at first, like it seemed to be out of a horror movie or something. I said, "Hello, how are you?" because I really didn't know what to do. He then proceeds to whistle a kid's song and walk slowly towards us. Well, as you might have figured too, we were terrified by this, and we started to back up a bit, and then we ran away from that thing. He didn't run though, at least, we didn't see him run, but every time that we thought that we were away from it, he would just reappear around the corner of another street. We couldn't find anybody else in the streets, and it was getting dark at this point. We ran again and hid behind some trees for half an hour or more. Then we proceeded to look for the right path back to a house, and we saw him once again when we were already far from the place that we had hid. But he had his back to us at this point, so he didn't see us. After that, we thought, well, it must have been someone just playing a prank on random people or something. But we then saw on the news a week later that someone had been attacked by a clown. Not severely hurt, thankfully, but still. The police were looking for this clown, but couldn't find him anywhere. I hazard a guess that in our small town, that it must have been the same person. So, I'm a tradie in my 30s, and I have a female partner that is a bit younger than me. I live in Queensland, Australia, and last year during Christmas holidays, we decided to have a 10-day trip with a camper van around state. After exploring the beach side of the state, we decided to go inland. We camped overnight in a lookout over a gorge with a great view. There were 2 more campers, so not a busy spot. Unfortunately, though, it started raining, so we waited to explore the next day. It started to get dark, and when we woke up, I saw that the number of the campers didn't change as rain continued during the next day. That was a bit disappointing, but we still decided to go explore the top of the mountain range, a long narrow hilltop that was a short distance from the camping spot, just a few minutes walking. Our destination was probably only about maybe an hour there and back, and had some man-made stairs at the beginning of the trail. They were basically just rocks, but there were also big stones positioned in sort of the natural tiles in the ground every now and there. Not in a regular pattern or anything, random and scarce, but I would estimate they'd probably weigh about 100 kilos and were mostly flat with the rest of the terrain deep in the ground. On both sides of the narrow range were very steep sides, definitely not accessible, but they had a great view of the surrounding dense forests all the way that you could see anyway. What I'm trying to paint here is that, basically, we were in the middle of nowhere. The way to the end of the range, though, was through some obstacles, where I had to help my girlfriend climb up some big rocks and other stuff. Once we made it to the end, there was a sharp end and a drop-off into the gorge beneath. But we took some pictures and decided to go back to our RV eventually. We still haven't seen or heard anyone, and the path from the beginning to the end was very narrow with the visibility of both sides, so no one could have walked past us. Of course, there were trees and other obstacles on the path. We could not see much back from where we came from, but what we noticed on the way back were some of those large stones mentioned before. They were missing. You could see the fresh holes in the ground too, and we definitely would have seen them missing on the way in the first time, as there was only one way there and back. I would say that there were about maybe 10 plus of them missing across the whole way back, and they were not from the same spot. There were maybe, 50 altogether, randomly positioned. For the life of me too, I just cannot explain how someone could dig them up and carry them back to their truck or something in that time. And I mean, even if someone decided that they wanted it in their garden or something, it's just not humanly possible to lift them like that. Now, this experience was, I think, the next day or maybe the one after in a different place of the same national park. It was called Carnarvon National Park. It's a massive range connected to other state forests and parks and whatnot. The weather didn't improve either, and we didn't see many people in our next destination either. There were only 2 or 3 cars on which is usually a very popular spot. We decided to take a hike anyway of one of the indicated routes showed on the map. Most were leading to different parts, and some even divided further. I would guess that we were about 3 hours in, and we decided that we'd had enough, combined with the weather, and seen what we wanted to, and so we were about to turn back when we walked past a route that was blocked off by a sort of fencing and with a warning sign that said, "Closed due to flooding and inaccessible road." It was a route that would stretch for another 20 kilometers, but I've seen that there was a small waterfall just close, maybe around 1 kilometer away that way, so I persuaded my girlfriend to go. She was hesitant at first, not trusting the sign, but eventually she agreed. We walked around the blocked entrance easily, was only walking around a few trees to the side, and continued on the path. I should mention too that I carry a machete in my backpack along with some emergency stuff like snacks and water. Call me paranoid, but hey, I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it, right? Anyway, after about 20 or 30 meters of walking, we reached that little waterfall. On the way there were some fallen trees on the path that we had to climb over, as walking around just wasn't always possible. It started to drizzle again, a bit stronger this time, so we decided to go back after we reached our destination. We took a few pictures, spent a few minutes. I will say again that we did not see anyone that day, since the handful of people at the beginning of the car park at the very bottom, they went a different route. We started walking back after a few minutes when I just suddenly felt this feeling like we were being watched. In fact, I stopped and felt the hair on my arm standing up. It was a feeling like something wanted to harm us. Now, My girlfriend doesn't really believe stuff like that, and definitely doesn't understand why I would carry a machete into the forest, unless planning to cut through the jungle, of course, but this is Australia. We don't have access to guns like you guys do in the States. So I told her that we should go faster, and that I just don't feel safe. After a few minutes of walking with me constantly looking around, I stopped and decided to take my Crocodile Dundee knife out. Once I did this, I decided to whistle. I don't know why. Maybe it was to just break the silence, to maybe scare something away. And not like we have bears here or anything. It wasn't a long-tone whistle, but rather a few short melodic sort of like whistles. And at first, nothing happened, so we continued walking with my knife in hand, and after a very short time, I would say 10 seconds, we then heard the same whistle come back at us. Now, the visibility from the footpath is quite decent being on the bottom between the hills like this, going along a small creek, and I can tell you that there was no one that we could see. My hair on my arm started to raise again, and my girlfriend finally acknowledged that something just wasn't right, and started walking fast without me hustling her. I think she felt it too, but we had to make it to the entrance section that was blocked and then back to the main track without any further incident. And all the way there, I felt just like I was being watched and not wanted there at all. As soon as we did make it to the normal trail, all feelings of being threatened subsided, and eventually we made it back and we just packed up and we left. So, the first thing happened a few months ago. I couldn't find my house keys one evening, despite them always hanging on the hanger next to the front door. My husband, daughter, and I turned the house upside down looking for them, but there was nothing. My husband left me his door key and he went off to work the next morning. My daughter went to school and I went to work, arriving home about lunchtime. I let myself in the door and then went to hang my husband's keys on the hook next to the door, as is my habit. And I literally jumped because my keys were on the hanger. The second thing only happened this past weekend. My daughter left her attic bedroom and went to stay at her dad's house on Sunday at about, I would say, 3 p.m. She went from there to school on the Monday morning, then got home to my house at about 4:30 p.m. Monday. She went straight to her room to get changed, but came flying back downstairs with a face like thunder. "You've been in my bedroom," she yelled. I told her calmly that I hadn't. I mentioned her having the attic bedroom as the steps are steep and I have arthritic knees, so I don't venture up there. So she believed me when I told her that I hadn't, but she went from furious to ashen-faced. "Why?" I asked. "Well, there's a lit candle on my desk." Just to mention a couple of things too, the candle was a small one, maybe like 5 centimeters tall, and not one that could be left burning for over 24 hours. There wasn't anything in her room that could have lit the candle as well, no matches, lighter, or anything. No one was home except for me the entire time, and I know that I didn't go up there. Okay, so I know that this is a really weird one, but bear with me. I hope that you guys can give me some perspective or insights into what you guys think this might be. When I was growing up, my family lived in this huge, beautiful southern-style home, and I really loved it. I have very fond memories there. However, it was the most active home of all that I've lived in since. Very active. But only to my mother and I. You see, my 2 brothers and my dad, they never had any experiences. My mother had a couple. I was the only girl though, and about 3 when we moved in, and I had a lot. At first, being so young, I didn't really think anything of the experiences. I didn't know any better. Later though, I'd find out that they were not what other people see or interact with normally. but I'll tell you guys all the one that mostly stands out. One night, I woke up and I rolled over. I was barely awake and it was dark in the room. I didn't have a nightlight. But I noticed that there was some sort of a black thing lingering at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make it out right then, so I sat upright in my bed and tried to make it out, but I still couldn't really, so I got on my knees and leaned toward it. Now, remember, the whole room is dark, but I can clearly see that there's something there. It's not a figure, it's just sort of suspended in darkness. As I leaned towards it, within like 2 feet I would guess, it looks a lot like a hand, but not a hand because it only has 3 fingers, bent slightly as if they were just sort of hanging there. It had no fingernails but pointy tips. It wasn't connected to any body either. I just sort of leaned back against my bed frame and watched it until eventually I just fell back asleep because it never moved. This happened a couple more times, but it seemed to be closer to me each time. Then one night, my cousin stayed over and she slept with me. I woke up and rolled over to face her, and it was right there in my face, hanging directly over her as she slept. It had never been that close before, and I was scared, but I could actually reach out and touch it, and a part of me wanted to. I reached my arm out and then just sort of pulled it back, and in the end, I never did touch it. I just sort of watched it until, again, I just fell asleep. But that was the last time that I saw it. Fast forward 10 years though, and I was helping my mum in the kitchen with supper. As we were talking, that old house came up somehow, and I finally told her what I saw, and she immediately stopped what she was doing. She asked me more. Then she took 2 pieces of paper out and asked me to draw it. While she was doing something on the other piece of paper, and when I finished, she finished. She asked that we swap papers, and we did, and she had, for all intents and purposes, drawn the exact same thing. We both just sort of looked at each other in amazement. She then told me that when she was little, she had went to a slumber party and all the girls slept on the living room floor in sleeping bags. She said that she woke up in the middle of the night and saw this claw thing hanging over the girl next to her. She reached out to touch it, and before she did, the girl screamed loudly. Everyone woke up and the girl was crying and saying someone had pinched her. My mum was accused of doing this, of course, but she swore that she never would have done such a thing. But this girl had clearly been pinched hard enough to even draw blood. I've done some research on this, and honestly, I haven't been able to come up with anything like this. So, what do you guys think? I live in the foothills of Western NC near the base of the Blue Ridge. I lived in the mountains for a few years and I hated it up there. I despise the woods with a burning passion. Yet, just my luck, I've moved back in with my folks, in their cabin surrounded by woods. The land my family owns stretches across about 15 acres of woodland. Now, these are the woods that I grew up in, and despite my typical aversion to nature, I feel pretty safe in them. I climbed the trees and splashed in the creek and played with stick swords when I was a kid there, so these woods are sort of like home. Except for the area behind the backyard. You see, our cabin is positioned at the top of a pretty steep hill that slopes down for about half a mile before it bottoms out at a creek down in the woods. The halfway point between the house and the creek is this little patch of woods, right behind the fenced-in area around the house. It's always in shade, no thick undergrowth, just, trees. Carolina red clay, piles of leaves, the usual. But it just feels really weird down there in a way that it's hard to explain. I feel very unwelcome out behind the house, and I'm not the only one. My parents avoid it too. Even our pets, past and present, have always steered clear of it. Anyway, I'm going to share some experiences that should help to get my point across better. I was about 8 or 9, and one summer thought that I'd try camping in the backyard. I set up my family's unused tent, loaded it up with an air mattress and a pile of blankets. Copper was there too, my beloved deer Stuffy, and some comic books. I guess I wanted to be excited about it, but even before the sun went down, when Mum was helping me set up my little camping trip, I just felt really uneasy. The shady patch of woods around the backyard was just weird, but I was a kid, so I figured, to heck with it. I'm 20 feet from the house anyway. I'll be fine. I was not fine. I got set up for the night, stayed up reading comics, felt like an outdoorsman, and it had barely gotten dark when I began hearing loud, rhythmic crunching in the woods behind the backyard. Like something big was walking in circles around the undergrowth. We don't have bears in my neck of the woods. Besides, whatever it was definitely walking on 2 legs. It never tried to approach the backyard. Even as I sat there with Copper just listening to it, it just kept walking. In the end, I barely lasted an hour in that tent before running inside and getting into my own bed. Now, my mum is an avid gardener, and she decided one day that she was going to put together 4 or 5 raised garden beds in the backyard for herbs and veggies. This was when I was 11-ish, I think, so naturally I was roped in to help. We spent the first part of the spring just putting them together and getting them started, and I began noticing that both of us would get really edgy and irritable back there. We're best friends, and we never fight, but we'd be snapping at each other constantly, raising that garden. I also noticed for the first time that the woods behind the house were deathly quiet. Playing music or talking didn't make a difference too. It was that kind of silence that presses in on you, and it's just always back there. To our surprise though, the beds actually thrived for a little while, but Mum would always ask me to come with her when she tended to them. I thought that it was silly at the time, but when I got older, she told me that she just couldn't be down there by herself. She'd wait until I was home from school before checking on them because she too felt uneasy and unwelcome down there. Eventually, we just abandoned the project too. It got so bad, but the raised beds are still down there, just rotting away in the undergrowth. Haven't checked on them since middle school, and I'm 23 now. And lastly, and in my opinion the creepiest, was the time that I asked my mum to cut my hair. We were poorer then, so rather than go to a salon, Mum just gave me a twice-a-month trim. It was late spring and warm, so she suggested that we cut it in the backyard for easier cleanup. I was maybe 13 or 14 at this point. So we ventured down, I brought a stool and sat diligently while she cut my hair. Side note too, my mum has always cut my hair, so she's really good at it. She doesn't make mistakes, and this is important. So as she worked, we talked, and I noticed that old familiar feeling of unease again. We were not welcome back there all of a sudden, and the trees stood still and shadowy despite the brilliant sunny day, and I remember that it was just really, really cold. Mum finished up my haircut, and I shook off the extra debris to let her admire her handiwork. She stepped around in front of me, angled my head this way and that, said it looked good. And then, 3 things happened in very quick succession. First, I felt this squeeze of pressure on my lungs, like I couldn't breathe. It was such a weird sensation that I just froze. All of the uneasiness of the atmosphere pressed in on me all at once. Second, my mum got this really weird vacant look on her face. I remember her smile fading and her eyes going a little glassy, like she was lost in thought or something. And then, she reached out with the scissors, still making this empty expression, and snipped a deep cut into the skin right over my left eye. I, obviously freaked out, jumped down off the stool and backed away. At the same time, she seemed to gather herself again, and she was almost in tears. She apologized over and over again, not even bothering to take anything with us as we ran back to the house to treat the cut and stop the bleeding. I still have a little scar there, in fact, and she's never really forgiven herself for it. There wasn't even any hair hanging over that eye or anything either. I had a pixie cut at the time. So yeah, a few of the many weird experiences that makes me avoid the backyard now, and I haven't been down there in like 7 or 8 years. But now that I'm living here again, I just sometimes look into the backyard and feel that weird shudder of apprehension again. And I mean, what's the deal, right? Why don't we feel welcome in a 50 square foot patch of land that we own? Why is it so dark there all the time and quiet? I have no idea, but my parents and I just work around it and pretend like it isn't there.